Charles Landry is an international authority on the use of imagination and creativity in urban change. He's currently a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin, invented the concept of the creative city in the late 80s, and its focus on how cities can create enabling conditions for people and organizations to think, plan, act with imagination to solve problems and develop opportunities. Charles facilitates complex urban change and visioning processes and undertakes tailored research, often creating his own projects, which include the Urban Psych Test developed with Chris Murray and the Creative City Index in collaboration with Bilbao and developed with Jonathan Hyams. This strategic tool measures, evaluates, and assesses the innovative ecosystem of a city and its capacity to adapt to radical global shifts and adjustments, and has had participation in 23 cities. His latest major project, the picture-driven The Civic City in a Nomadic World, brings together his work over the last decade, including the concept of civic urbanity and creative bureaucracy and the management of fragility. Welcome.
Thanks a lot. Can I invite all those speakers over here just to come here briefly? And I'm just going to ask you, we've got to capture time, so I'm going to restrict this, unfortunately. But anyway, I'm going to ask you a question, because obviously we've seen a range of innovations. When you take a helicopter view of a place like South Australia, you can see incredibly interesting things, and obviously Australia as a whole. But three things seem to me quite interesting. I just want to ask you this question, you as a group. Do you think we've reached critical mass on that with some of these innovative ways of responding to the new world we're entering? Do you think we have the opportunity to then scale that up? And do you think it's embedded or embedding across political cycles? Is that all right as a question? Does anyone want to start off responding to that? Irma, do you want to start?
Get it over and done with, I think. Look, I might just pick on one of them. You asked about critical mass. I believe that we're small, but I think we've done enough in South Australia to show, I guess, the rest of, I'm talking public sector, and how we might do things differently. We actually have shown a way forward in relation to that. I'd say probably not as big as I'd like it to be, but when listening to Jim and others, I think we're on the cusp. We've got the foundational piece, and we have to disrupt it yet again. So I think that there's another level of disruption, but it's possible we can do it, which is where we might get the actual scaler. The embedding across political cycles is an interesting one. Case in point for myself is that, and Claire mentioned it, we've got our contacts, and it's not, individuals don't do this, you work as a team, but you need enough of that critical mass to actually tell the story. So one of the things we want to do is make sure that we actually pay homage to the things that went before and what the conditions were to get it disrupted the way we did maybe 10 years ago, and then get others in, as Jim said, that have ideas that might be the new disruption to actually push it forward, but respect where we'd gone before so people don't trip over that or use old systems to have new ways of thinking. And you can do it along political cycles if there's a compelling case, and individuals need to sell that to a government coming in. You need this for your public sector. That's certainly what I said to the Premier.
And thanks for that. What about you, Claire? Have you got a response to that?
I think the scalability is the thing that worries me within our organisation. If I've got a real challenge that I want some bright ideas and some new ways of thinking, I've literally got 20 people that I will go to out of an organisation of 1,000. And that's hard for those 20 people, because it's me constantly saying, have you thought of this, can we do that? And so for me, the scalability across our organisation is absolutely critical, and the sustainability of that, so that I can walk away knowing that the legacy is that I've got an organisation that is responsive, agile, flexible, and people feel really comfortable coming into work day in, day out, being able to be the best people that they can be.
What about you, Rod? Have you got a response to that question?
So I think of critical mass in terms of there's an innovation vanguard, and the task is to pull as many people as possible into that innovation space, into that different mindset of how they actually operate and function. to get them into a space that is more naturally more collaborative and more experimental. I actually think that South Australia's got a really interesting scale question. And what I mean by that is you're very strong in the strong ties. So in really big cities like Sydney or Melbourne, there are a lot of weak ties. There are a lot of loose networks. What strikes me about South Australia, having come here for sort of 20 years and worked very closely with governments, is actually everybody knows each other. And the ability to actually get hold of someone to get something done within 24 hours gives you an enormous strength if you can think about how you can leverage it and leverage those really strong ties. I also think that your scale increases automatically if you stop thinking of the public sector as the only players in public problem solving. So if you start to think of what's the role of progressive businesses in solving those problems, of impact investment, of philanthropy, of social movements, then suddenly your scales increase quite dramatically, but we don't think in that way just yet. Across the political cycles, I'm probably more sceptical here, so I do a lot of work on what are the characteristics of innovation institutions that persist and survive. And they're usually ones that don't get captured politically or bureaucratically or by vested interests. But the truth is they're also ones that often emerge on the back of a burning platform or an external threat. We don't have that. We actually have a pretty good quality of life. Things are never so bad that we're forced to, be Israel and think about our very existence and what we have to do to secure ourselves and therefore innovate around that. We're not Finland, who had to think about life after a different type of relationship with Russia that's just a few kilometres away. We're not Singapore. We're not a small country in a really volatile region trying to find our way. And this is kind of an Australian problem, but I think it's a problem for every part of Australia as well, which is why I actually think that you need an institutional response. I actually, one of the things we talk about in the report, I worked with Nesta in the UK, the National Endowment for National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, and for Sitra in Finland. So Sitra was set up as a national innovation institution to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Finland. Its job is national public problem solving. I think we need a National Institute for Public Problem Solving, but if we're not going to get a national one, then get one in South Australia.
What about that thing about, everybody says it's so great to live in Adelaide and all of that, and that can make people complacent. How do you generate urgency in that context?
Yeah, it's. I think it is really difficult because I think the truth is we do have a really good quality of life, and I think what it forces us to think about is how do we create things institutionally that prompt us and almost force us to think differently. Because I do think it's actually a really big problem in Australian sort of reform debates in general. We're actually just too comfortable and we don't have anything that's really challenging us. So we've got to manufacture those sort of organisational arrangements or institutional arrangements that, as sort of Nesta puts it, put everyone on an inevitable path of innovation and learning.
Matthew, you mentioned a bit of a crisis, which could be something that generates urgency. How do you respond to that question?
Well, I think the point is that we have a high living standard and there's no burning platform is a really important one, because having remembered the 1980s when I first cut my teeth as a bureaucrat, there were really driving problems. There was an exceptional combination of public service and cabinet that really saw the need for change, and I think chose key changes that had an inevitable logic that flowed to other things in that process. So going back to the question of critical mass, scale up and embedding, I find that very difficult to assess. I don't know South Australia as well as I would like. I like it a lot, let me say. But I think the manifestations of some insular activities, some observed stovepipes in bureaucracy, I think are all things that suggest to me that we're not yet at critical mass, and that the sort of work that Irma and the proponents are doing is actually really important to push on. I guess the main things that I would be looking for in the extent to which we're getting more of the critical masses looking for quite determinedly collegial behaviour, particularly in relation to the ownership of problems that intrinsically can only be solved by a whole set of agencies or groups working together. Now, I think it's absolutely within the grasp of the state to do that, and I think it probably does that from time to time, but my evidence is limited.
Jen, you seem to be a rather energetic optimist. Well, you're energetic.
Yeah.
You mentioned the pioneering spirit and history of South Australia and so on. Can that sometimes push you back when you've had that history, or do you think is the weight of that too much, or do you think people can really find a way of being energised through that?
Look, I think we should be energised through it, and I think the story of people like Sir Ross and Keith Smith, people like Hubert Wilkins and all sorts of other leaders, not only in terms of technology but in terms of community, in terms of politics, the Don Dunstans of this world, all those sorts of things. Those are cause for celebration, and those are stories that I think we fail to tell. And sometimes we need to be told how significant those activities and those events and those achievements are by people totally removed from the state. We had a NASA astronaut living in South Australia last year, Pam Melroy, who's one of the two women to command the space shuttle. She's commented on several occasions in public forums about what the Smith brothers did as basically akin to man landing on the moon. And I just think, we do not celebrate those really, really fabulous stories. We have got a real issue in Australia, but I think specifically in South Australia, about big noting ourselves and boasting. And I'm not suggesting we boast, but let's take real pride in our achievements, in our history, and what we are capable as a state of achieving. And I want to see more of those stories out there. I think it's really, really important.
So one of the key messages from many of you was really South Australia is big enough to do things, but small enough. There's the big and the small thing.
There's connectivity.
But the connectivity can sometimes become parochial, can't we? So that balance between knowing each other too much also has a flip side, doesn't it? So this infusion of the external, how do we do that? I mean, you occasionally need that as well, don't you, in order to...
I'll make a comment there just very quickly. I think every organisation needs that, whether it's a company, whether it's a government. We need to get new blood in and fresh blood in. Sometimes we are a little bit parochial. Having said that, I'm a Victorian. I've been more or less accepted in the state, which can be a challenge. But we need to encourage people to come and stay and work. And I think things like the Thinkers in Residence scheme was a really, really good way to do that. I'd like to see that. I might get in trouble for this, but I'd like to see schemes like that again. And I'd really like, this goes back to the whole points of cross politics or cross political cycles. If good ideas come from the other side of politics, we should not care, and bluntly, our politicians should not care either. And when I took this job on, I said to the Premier, success for me is in 5 years' time, there's a chief entrepreneur that is 2 orders of magnitude more capable than me, and that the organisation is respected across political boundaries as contributing to the state.
Final question before we go into tea and all that sort of stuff. Do you think, looking at a 10-year stretch, just a brief response, there has been a big shift here in the context of our discussion today, for example?
I believe there has, and I mean, taking our relationship and your being the first thinker in residence, looking at creative cities, we're now looking at creative bureaucracies. So there is a path that we actually set. It's massively different, but we need to consider the conditions that made us kind of get to where we have now, and what are those conditions going forward. And so how do we have that legacy, but we build on it for what South Australia needs now, and its citizens in particular.
I mean, Claire, you implied a bit, having gone through that journey,
Mm.
would you say something similar to that?
Absolutely, a massive shift. If I, having been in the organisation 18 years, if I look back to what it was like 18 years ago to where we are now, we're much more open, we're much more responsive. But as Irma said, what we need to do now is make that into a sustainable model, so that that's just how we work.
Unfortunately, I'm going to stop here because given that other opening, that was much longer, and we came here later, and I know you all got to ultimately have lunch at some point. So we're going to where? Foyer E?
Just
There. And when are we back? When do you want us back?
We're gonna shorten.
11:40? That's 20 minutes. Is that enough, or are you freaked out by that? Are you okay?
Renee would like 11:30, so if you're keen,
A round of applause for these wonderful